Moral evil is easier from a theological perspective to explain, in the sense that, unlike natural evils, moral evil actually is always the consequence of human freedom, and therefore is not a natural feature of reality. Why would God allow human beings to do that to each other if in fact God is all-knowing and all-powerful and all-loving, all-good? Well, it actually comes back to God's love. If God seeks a relationship with us, God seeks to experience our love. God desires our love. Atheism, instead of liberating the human will, it's actually the death of free will. It's the death of free will. Why? So, if God does not exist, and that's what atheism is claiming, existence by definition is accidental and arbitrary. And all that exists is matter, stuff. That's it. It's just stuff. Okay? So, if existence is accidental, that's called materialism. If existence is accidental and arbitrary, well, you know what that means? That means you and me, well, we're accidental and arbitrary as well. Full stop. Full stop, right? Totally arbitrary. There's no meaning, purpose to us. So, that means that we are created and maintained. If the atheists are right, we're created and maintained until death by blind forces that are completely outside of our control. So despite whatever illusions that I may have that I'm a self, a responsible self, a self that makes choices and acts and is loved and is capable of loving, or that I have a nature, or that I have a meaning or purpose, that's all an illusion. It's all just generated by these arbitrary chemical reactions, right? If atheism is true, that necessarily is true. So any choice that we make, any kind of love you experience or any sense of responsibility or purpose, it's all an illusion. So if that's all an illusion, you know what else is an illusion? Freedom is an illusion. You can't destroy everything and say, but I take this one back, right? It doesn't make sense. You can't say that everything is arbitrary except for freedom. Because, and to go back to this conception of materialism, if matter is all that matters, show me the freedom atom. Like seriously, where's the freedom atom or the quark or the freedom electron? Like where is it? If you're talking about everything being material but we still have free will of some sort, then you're going to have to show me matter, freedom on a platter that is just made up of stuff. It doesn't exist, therefore freedom doesn't exist. You see? So atheism is being inconsistent if it claims that there is no God and yet human freedom is something real. They're the ones destroying human freedom, not the theists. On the other hand, if God does exist, then free will actually can exist. Now, we have to be clear here that this depends on your definition of God. There's lots of different definitions of God, and if I conceive of God as this sort of ornery tyrant who totally controls his subjects, then I might not get free will out of that. But that's not the Christian God. Okay, so that's not an issue for Christianity. It may be for some other conceptions of God. There's nothing inherently incompatible with saying that God exists and God creates human freedom. It's not a contradiction. God can exist and God can genuinely create human freedom. And then what human freedom properly understood is the free choice to act in accordance with reality itself, and that's entirely up to us in one way or another, or to act against reality itself. So I'm not saying that we're totally free, but we're saying we're actually free. And we can say that we're actually free only because freedom exists because God has created it. So free will is actually a gift of theism or belief in God, not of atheism. All right, the last objection, objection 3. Believing in God makes you a closed-minded, intolerant sheep. I'm sure you've all heard that, right? Or one variation of that. Closed-minded, intolerant sheep. So, I want to break these down. First, closed-minded, then we'll look at intolerant, then we'll look at the nature of sheepness. Okay. Closed-minded. What does it mean to be closed-minded? To be closed-minded, in a most basic sense, means that you're not open to any new ideas. Okay, but look at here. Closed is an adjective of minded. So there's something about mindedness here. So what does it mean to be minded in the first place? So I want to know what my mind is to make sure that it's not closed. Okay, so I need to get zero in on mind. Okay, a mind means that you're capable of logical and rational thought. You're capable of identifying and weighing evidence. And you're capable of coming to a conclusion that is true, or at least most plausible. But it looks truer than the alternatives. But wait a minute, if that's what mind means, then that implies that what? Logic and rationality somehow exist, that they're not just sheer illusions or fantasies or fever dreams that we have, and B, that the truth, at least some sense, actually exists. So in order to say that there is a mind, that the mind has these features, you're saying that there's some kind of truth and mechanism for apprehending the truth. Wait a minute. If there's no God, then there's no truth except for the truth that there is no truth, which literally means that any other thing that you could possibly say in any sphere of life, whether political or religious or social, is moot. In other words, you're the most closed-minded person ever if you are sincerely following the logic of your own position. There's nothing left to discover if there is no God, because all conclusions lead back to that one nullity. So you literally have nothing else to say. You just wait until you die. Like, stop bugging everybody else. Just be until your time comes. You see, our minds necessarily, in order to be open, need to be open to a reality, not a nullity. So the condition for the possibility of being open-minded is recognizing that there is something for the mind to grasp besides the absence of being, right? So as opposed to being the enemy of open-mindedness, theism is what makes open-mindedness properly understood, because an infinitely open mind is no longer a mind, it has no constraints. But open-mindedness in the sense of the search for truth, the only possibility for that is to say that there is a truth that somehow precedes the mind, that's not dependent upon the mind itself. So it's theists who are open-minded, not atheists. How about intolerance? We're intolerant. Okay. Smell test. This is one of my favorite tests in philosophy. When you hear somebody say something, you're like, That doesn't pass the most basic muster of experience. So here's the smell test. Which group of people demonstrates greater intolerance nowadays? Believers or unbelievers? Right? Where do you find most intolerance nowadays? If my experience has been any indication, I can see from your faces, that looks like this is not just anecdotally mine. The greatest sources of intolerance, meaning that I can't even abide you saying an idea that disagrees with my idea, and so I'm going to find some way to make your position not only unable to be expressed, but pathological, meaning that if you say that, you're either insane or evil. So I'm going to change the mechanism of free speech so that only certain ideas can be uttered. Where's that coming from? Is that coming from the Catholics? Is it coming from the Christians? No, it's not. It's not. All right. So smell test wise, this isn't a problem. So it's a red herring in that sense. But red herring or no red herring, let's dig down into the actual substance of the charge. So what would intolerance mean? It would mean not permitting, usually through coercion, the expression of ideas that you disagree with. But you see, there's nothing inherent in believing in God that makes you intolerant. All you're saying is that you believe in God. You're making a truth claim, and you're defending it with evidence and with explanations and with reasons and with counter-arguments. Well, you know who else makes truth claims? Are atheists, and presumably they are defending their arguments, presumably with evidence and with counter-arguments and so forth. So you have two groups here, both making truth claims, both believing they're right, but only one of them gets targeted as intolerant, right? So it's just, again, it just doesn't follow. It's a political mechanism designed to make people shut up. It's not actually a serious philosophical critique, right? So again, just because you believe in God does not necessarily mean that you cannot abide the existence of other kinds of arguments. And at the heart of this, we have to remember, and this is specifically thinking about the Christian God, right? Because again, you can cook up some pretty twisted ideas of God and prove the atheist point pretty quickly. So we have to be speaking about the right kind of God. We have to be speaking about the God as we understand it through reason and through Scripture. So that kind of God, the belief in that God is a free act. It's a purely free act. It literally cannot be coerced, meaning you cannot make somebody trust in God. You cannot make somebody confess that Jesus, maybe with their lips out of fear, but actually surrender their heart to the Lord. No one can force that. So even in the very core of it, if you're claiming that Christians are being intolerant, and if they in fact are being intolerant by somehow seeking to coerce people into believing, they're doing so not as Christians. Right? They've surrendered their Christianity in the very act of seeking to force people to convert. It doesn't make sense either logically or scripturally. So properly understood, we only conceive of God in such a way where the assent to God is 100% free. And so insofar as we're talking about that God, intolerance understood as coercion does not have a place. Finally, sheepishness. Sheepishness. Okay. As with the other charges, this is a non sequitur, meaning it doesn't follow. It's not even clear why it's there. It's just an insult that makes you with whose goal is to try and make you feel stupid. There's nothing inherent in the belief of God that entails sheepishness or requires sheepishness. So what does it mean to be sheepish? I think it's fair to say it means to follow authority blindly without asking any questions. Now, although some conceptions of God may demand blind obedience, God construed some ways, the Catholic conception of God never, ever, 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 ever has demanded that kind of approach. Remember, this is a cosmic love story from beginning to end. And love is predicated on freedom. And so to follow God, to love God with all your soul and your heart and your mind is to search God out, to ask the questions, to find the answers, and to go deeper and deeper and deeper. So again, God construed in the right way, the way that we can construe God as Catholics, has nothing to do with blind following of authority. And I see this get caught up all the time, especially in cultural dynamics and church dynamics as it plays out in different communities, including in Southern California, where people will conflate the obedience that we have to God to the obedience that we have to some particular person who's claiming to have authority over us. And the reality is that only true authority is attached to God. And insofar as somebody is saying something that somehow goes against that which we know to be true as revealed and or present to us in natural law and reason, that person has zero authority. And so we don't owe them obedience. So sheepishness can be a problem. I'm not saying it's not a problem. I'm saying it's not an inherent problem. It's not necessary. It's something we actually have to be wary of and kick out any time that we find it. So just the charge of sheepishness of self against a believer is not necessary. So here I want to quote the Catechism. We're drawing to a close here. Catechism, great book. It's a great page turner. If you ever want to know, I won't tell you how it ends. If you ever want to know what the church teaches, it's thick. You could always go to the Catechism. And don't tell anybody I said this. I hope no one's filming this. But if you hear somebody saying something to you as a representative of the church that doesn't sound right, then go to the Catechism and you can see what the church, through its traditions, has not only just arbitrarily chosen to be true, but has argued that this is the best way to understand this. And let's hold each other to account, right? So that was a brief plug for the Catechism. I don't get any royalties from their sales. So this is the Catechism. Revelation, adapted to the intelligence of all, shows that the assent of faith is by no means a blind impulse of the mind. So it's in the Catechism. Assenting to God has nothing to do with blindness. So in conclusion, the existence of evil does not disprove the existence of God. You could actually argue the opposite. Belief in God does not imply the rejection of free will. You could argue the opposite. And belief in God does not entail being closed-minded, intolerant, or sheepish. And again, you could argue the opposite. Now, as the last point, to sort of try and draw this all together, these are all defensive arguments. I was in a defensive posture, feeling a bit aggressive, but basically, holding back, saying, I'm getting barraged with all of these things, and here's my response to them. That's fine. We're in a defensive age right now, and I don't mean that in a negative sense. There's the church is under attack from within itself and from many different quarters. So there's nothing wrong with defending your arguments, but we always have to remember that defense always has to be ultimately in the service of offense. In other words, that every time we're offering an explanation, on the flip side of the explanation, we should always be making the proclamation, because ultimately what it is to spread the gospel is not from a defensive stance, but from a stance of boldness and confidence and ultimately love. And so while apologetics has its necessary place at the heart of the faith, It's only insofar it's the armor, as it will, that helps bring us out into the world to spread the good news and to continue doing so, even when we feel like the whole world is against us. So, to be continued, and thanks again for being with me tonight. God bless you all.
Do you want to fall in love with God? I'm sure we all want to. The book of Psalms contains the directions. Thousands of years ago, people like you and me talked to God out of the depths of their hearts, revealing an intimate love. Psalms are the expression of the faith in God by people around 3,000 years ago. God was not a mere abstract creator, but was present, involved, and a real person of power and emotions. Now, when we read or listen to the Psalms, we can know the intensity of this love. Entering into the influence of the Psalms, we can find a path to know and love God. To know more about the Psalms, you should get a copy of Father Mike Manning's booklet, The Psalms. It will help you to understand the 150 Psalms better as he has categorized them. He uses the technique of acts: adoration, contrition, thanksgiving, and supplication. Get your copy today and know the categories. Learn to pray with the Psalms.
Call the number on the screen or email us. You can also get it through our website. Get your copy today.
Even as you go through these, if a person wants to say God doesn't exist, or basically if they've gone through some rough stuff in their life, they will not always, but they will probably be inclined to blame God no matter what.
It's
no matter what the
natural,
other, you know, because God is all good, because God loves me, because God knows everything. Why is this happening to me? You know, that's and it's not because of a lack of belief in a God, but it's your human condition. Why?
Yeah.
And you know, it's just because you try to rationalize why is this happening.
Yeah.
And maybe you can rationalize and see some of the things that led you to this, but I can understand very well when somebody has suffered something greatly diminishing to them, how they will question God.
Of course, that's it's natural in a sense, right? And I'm sure all of us have done it. When I was going through a really rough patch once, and I went to go meet with a priest, and he said, "You need to read the book of Job." I was like, "That's the last book I want to read right now, is the book of Job." And so I went to go read the book of Job, and it didn't really help me, because Job was going through some very, very terrible things, and Job perhaps is the only person in history ever not to rebel. So he does ask why, but he never flips over into outright rebellion. He always says, no, God is God. It only occurred to me a long time later that I was reading the book of Job wrong. What I was looking for in the book of Job was some sort of therapeutic release from my own suffering, as if it were like I was reading the book of Oprah or something like that. But what the book of Job, at the heart of the book of Job, is the idea that God is God, independent of how we feel about it. And that, within one light, can be terrifying, because we can say, how can it be that God is and I am in this particular situation? But if we can pass through that darkness, what we see on the other side is that the truth, in a sense, as cliche as it is, it does set you free. Because it means that no matter what is happening to you now, it is all for good. It is all for good. And that what matters is that you hang on to the truth, not because it feels good, not because it's giving you relief or release in this very instant, but because it's true. There's an insight in cognitive behavior psychology, which they just ripped off from the Catholics, which it's an adaptation of virtue theory, which is that you act as in such a way where you don't treat your feelings as real. So oftentimes our beliefs and our feelings get really wrapped up together. So if I'm feeling terrified, therefore I believe that terror is what most fundamentally exists. Or if I believe that I'm weak, then I believe that, or if I'm feeling weak, then I believe that I actually am fundamentally a weak person. Or if I'm feeling depressed, I actually believe that I'm actually no good, right? And what cognitive behavioral therapists will get you to try and work on, from a purely secular perspective, is that, you know what, your feelings are not reality. They're a response to reality. So try to live according to reality and not your feelings about reality. So let me tell you the reality. Well, again, that's just ripping off the scriptural insight here, which is that live according to the truth that God exists and God loves you. That doesn't always mean that you're going to feel good. That doesn't always mean that everything is going to come together in the moment that you want it to come together. But again, that doesn't mean it's not true. Job got that. Job understood that. And he understood it through every single terrible thing that happened to him. He didn't understand it 10% or 20% or even 85% or even to the A range, 90% he understood it. He understood it 100% that God is God. And see what happens to Job at the very end of the story. And that's the insight. The insight is stay true to the truth. And that will carry you through. And that gets ramped up all the way once we import that into the story of the crucifixion and the resurrection. So it may not help in the moment for the person to hear that God is in control, but if they're willing to stick with it, it will. It will.
You know, there are things that we question, and somehow you give us the answer to deepen our understanding. Anyway, I have little curiosity. Like temptation, as what you said, the natural evil, despite of the human freedom, is temptation is also part of God's, like, a test to us? That can we acknowledge temptation and yet we can segregate it, not to attempt or take that temptation, and yet we still be in the path of freedom of choice?
Yeah, it's a good. Well, I think one way to express that, if I'm interpreting the question correctly, is to say, well, doesn't every rose have to have a thorn, kind of thing? The actual answer is no. That from the Catholic perspective, that would mean that God created a world in which God intentionally desired and wanted, as it were, some form of evil as evil to exist, to be a test to human beings so that they could test their mettle, so that they could demonstrate themselves to be good. What Catholics would say, what the tradition would say, is that if God created evil, then that must be that there is evil within God, that God had a sort of a template in order to put into the world, which means God would be a God of evil and of goodness, which is not only against Scripture, but it's also against reason, right? In the sense that how can something be both purely good and not purely good at the same time in the same way? So to apply that to the question of temptation, it's that God never intended temptation. Temptation is the state of affairs in which we recognize that we desire something that we ourselves know we shouldn't be desiring, right? That's what temptation is. We never feel tempted, like I should, I'm so tempted to go exercise right now, or I'm so tempted to order the salad instead of the chicken wings. Oh, it burns so deep, but no, I am strong, right? We only feel tempted towards things that we know are destructive to us, but we want them. But they're destructive to us, and so that generates the tension. So if we could locate this within Genesis, one of the first sin perhaps wasn't the bite of the fruit. It was, and she looked at the fruit and saw it was a delight. Yeah. That was the opening of the chasm that we created in the nature of reality, not God. So we have this draw to be God. We have this draw to be a source of our own value. We have a draw to be something that we're not. God didn't create us with that desire. God created us with the desire to love God and freedom. And what we did is we combined freedom and desire into this mutant force that created evil. And the reason we feel temptation is because we're still drawn to the good, you see. There's like a magnet, it's pulling us, and we're desperately reaching for our own destruction. So we only experience temptation, as it were, because there's a part of us that still knows to stay away from that which is destructive. But it's always the boring angel, right? It's the downer.
Okay. Actually, what she asked you and your response kind of prompted a thought. I read, I don't know, a few weeks ago about the praying the Lord's Prayer and that we're praying it wrong.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So can you comment a little bit about that? You know, saying that he wouldn't purposefully lead us into temptation.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I just want you to
Sure.
comment on that.
The general interpretation of what that means as it comes out in English is not that God is like seducing us into an area in order to tempt us, but rather don't permit us to destroy ourselves. Stop us from doing stuff to ourselves that will destroy ourselves spiritually and physically. So it's more of in the sense of don't let your permissive will let me destroy myself. Actively help me. Actively give me your grace not to go down the path of temptation. But the way it comes out in English is a bit confusing. But no, God's not directly leading us into temptation. So this is the last episode in this particular unit of episodes. There will be more. And we're going to try and wrap things up by affirming the genius of monotheism. That's the name of today's lecture, the genius of monotheism. And so what I want to do today is to move from the defensive, from the apologetic standpoint, out into the affirmation, to really celebrate the whole idea and reality of God, and I think that the word genius is appropriate for it. Now, why? Think of our ancestors. Go back thousands and thousands and thousands of years, right? Now, the idea of God, it's just inscribed into human nature, right? Every single culture, as far as we can tell, that ever existed, has had this sort of innate recognition that there is a divinity. Now, at a gut level, it can make sense to say, well, there's a power in these mountains. There's a power in this ocean. There's a power in the skies. There's certainly a power in this fire, right? And so at that primordial level, we can see that there is that spark of the recognition that there is something beyond mere human perception, that there is a divine reality. And then comes along what we will eventually recognize as Judaism. And it's out of this small tribe that we have the birth of the idea of monotheism.